send out messages about 5. Or are we on? 3, 2. All right. Here it is, what I've been threatening for the last little bit. Gets very close again, I know I can say that, to the foundations, not only of language, but the foundations of even other things. So least we frighten any of the children or people that might be from out of town. Let's go back to the myth I was talking about. Of another place that had a myth, you recall, that their general approach to this kind of stuff, their kind of general declared insight to what life is about was, if you recall, and I quote, it's actually pretty simple. So let's go back into that myth so that we can all pretend that this is just all pretend. Over at that same place, very close to that same myth, they talk about 2 ways of living, 2 ways of fulfilling your greatest potential. And the 2 ways are, believe it or not, verbally pretty mundane. They're referred to as the way of knowledge and the way of thinking. But you need to note immediately that those are not the same thing. Now I'm aware of the fact that they, in their myth, said knowledge and thinking, which I think even in that other world approximates the difference between nouns and verbs. But note, it could have been put otherwise, and it wasn't. And yet your ordinary intelligence could very easily tell you that if we are still taking into account that your own intelligence recognizes that knowledge would appear to be a noun and that thinking would appear to be a verb. Notwithstanding, your ordinary intelligence would be very inclined to tell you, what can you make of use out of that? Because if they're not the same thing, and of course your ordinary intelligence, if it had been listening to some of us for a while, might say, wait a minute, operationally speaking, the operational definition, the way in which it is used by life, they might as well be the same thing. Knowledge is a thing, and thinking would be a process. It would be an ongoing process. And knowledge, although it would appear to be, although it is proclaimed to be, accepted to be, and blah blah to be, by the real cutting edge of the secondary world throughout history, knowledge would appear to be, claimed to be, the greatest thing that a man can accomplish. Beyond wealth, even in religious context, if you read a certain way, they might say to save your soul and etc. But that's another way of putting to save your soul, that is to better yourself while you're alive. And it gets out into very crude so-called religious terminology. It's such things as, well, I lived by certain ideas or I pursued a certain dogma to help save my eternal soul, my eternal life. But what they're talking about, even at the crude level, it may come out with those that are still that far down the nervous system that, yes, we are talking about life after death. But you should be able to hear by now that the real, more advanced, even in the mechanical sense, even at the city sense, the more advanced understanding of that is, it is a refining of oneself while one is alive. But the less your center of thinking is here, the more it is held by gravity down still in the blue and the red circuits, as we once called them, the more they are inclined to say, if questioned, if forced to analyze it just for a second, they'd say, well, being a good, whatever they are, Baptist or Christian, has not been that beneficial necessarily to me in this life. But it will be. The point I was making was that knowledge, even in the religious sense, if you can hear what I was pointing at, knowledge would be the best overall description of what humanity up until now, is still driven to believe would be the supreme payoff. That would be the supreme effort to be made, is to have knowledge, whether it was in a philosophical, academic, spiritual, scientific sense, or some mystical sense. Some great knowledge, if I had it, if I could work for it, if I could obtain it, if I could develop it, if I could find it, that would be the proper payoff, conclusion to one's life, to a life well spent. According to the myths on this other world, there is another way, and it would be called thinking, and not knowledge. And whereas knowledge would appear to be a conclusion, the thinking would be non-conclusive and would be simply an ongoing, strike simply if you are simple enough, would be an ongoing process. And there are several aspects to knowledge that are never considered vis-a-vis their myth. That is that knowledge is limited, it is rigid, and it is repetitious. Now let's, maybe a small verbal surprise. Instead of me saying, now that's no attack on knowledge, let's do it a different way. That's a blatant attack on knowledge. Okay? You didn't expect that. Of course, that's just from our view. But look, even though the way I used the terms and the way I held up my fingers in that aggressive manner, I assume you called. I hope I didn't waste my time. A drama coach told me how to... See, I was using it in a negative, aggressive sense. That knowledge is, what do we say? One finger, two, no. Limited, rigid, and repetitious. But all we'd have to do is change the inflection, if not the words. Get out your Roget's thesaurus of synonyms and find synonyms for rigid, limited, and repetitious. And I'm not going to sit here and try to do it since I'm standing. But those very things, what I want you to see, even though I'm started out with a little joke that is an attack, as opposed to me saying, now wait a minute, that's not an attack on ordinary knowledge, it's a damn attack. But looked at from another view, ordinary, secondary intelligence would not find that to be an attack. Because note, knowledge, the currency of knowledge, facts. I mean, if you've got knowledge of something, we're talking about facts. Just using everyday common city terminology and sense. We're talking about facts. Knowledge is not theories, it's not opinions, not beliefs. Knowledge, the currency, the pieces that make up knowledge are facts. Now, how might we describe, in a quiet, expansive sense, but very simply, what would be the basic, inescapable aspect of a fact? A fact can only be what it is and nothing else. I don't care what the dictionary says. I don't have time to fool around with these people anymore. That's what a fact is. It can only be what it is. It can't be anything else or it's not a fact. It then becomes a debatable fact. It then becomes a theory. It then becomes an ambiguous fact. That's the best they can do with it. But if it is going to be called a fact, it can only be whatever it is and not one other thing. And so what it does, once a fact is known about anything, it then precludes, it prohibits any additional thinking about it. It literally does. Now, it doesn't say that in the dictionary, and they're not going to teach you that in Logic 101. Your own nervous system would not go that far. But if you, to get into the operational definition, if you said, well, I know a fact, and you were a plumber, and you gave us a plumbing fact, and I said, well, and I started some kind of philosophical flim-flam like this on you, and I went, well, wait a minute. Facts are limiting. The plumber might go, wow, what do you mean? And I said, well, you say that if you do so-and-so to a sewer, then such and such will happen. Yeah. Well, now, wait a minute. Let's consider the other possibility. What if you're saying if we did that, it'd blow up the sewer, let's say. And the plumber says, yeah. And I said, wait a minute. What if we did it, but when we did it, perhaps we said a Hail Mary or we closed one eye? Isn't there the possibility that instead it might produce a genie? Or at least it might not blow up the sewer. Now, if the man actually had knowledge of the great profession of plumbing, and he had amongst his knowledge that fact that if you do so-and-so, you will blow up the sewer. And if I say, wait a minute, that's being very provincial in your thinking. Why not explore other possibilities? Now, even though it does not say in the dictionary, you do, surely some of you already jumped ahead. In the ordinary secondary sense, that would be insane. That is assuming, and I'm not questioning it, that whatever the fact was in plumbing, mathematics, that somebody who had knowledge of it said, this is a fact. Now, so wait a minute, let's consider an alternative. If he knows that's a fact, there is no alternative. And to even say, well, let's consider it. Just come on, let's consider it. If this man has knowledge of the field, he's going to assume that you're insane. Correctly so. That's what I mean by it is prohibited. The city does not allow it. And when it does, if it, for whatever anomalous reason might pop up, like a ward or a pimple on the city's thinking, if it had any widespread dissemination of some idea like, well, you know, whatever was considered to be a fact in some area in the city, and suddenly from some group or some guy was hollering, wait a minute, let's consider an alternative, and he had a big enough soapbox, a forum, he would simply be adjudicated as being nuts. But see, now ordinarily they would say, well, because we have logical proof, we have empirical proof that what he's saying is not true, because we already know the fact. And him saying, let's consider these other facts, the man's nuts. He's wasting our time, and he's crazy. Don't even listen to him. What are they really saying? They are literally, operationally saying that once a fact is known, any additional thinking, not any additional facts, because the facts can change, that Newton can be outvoted by quantum physics. But it's additional thinking is prohibited, not additional facts. Additional thinking, that once a fact is known, at least for right then, which is the only thing that episodic consciousness is concerned with, right then, the subject is closed. Or else knowledge would not be knowledge. The secondary world would not have a firm foundation at this area. It's always got a firm foundation at the primary level. But it would not have a firm foundation any further for what we've been pleased to call city consciousness, secondary consciousness, this that's built out on a new place out there on the range and here on the range. So all knowledge is a conclusion, and rightfully so in the city. But there is a complete set, a different order in the use of the intellect between thinking and knowledge. As opposed to knowledge being a conclusion, knowledge being a thing, then thinking would be an ongoing process, and as opposed to knowledge being limited, rigid, and repetitious. I guess we can go over that for a second, but I already hit it without being specific, that a fact has got to be limited. That's what we just got through going through. It has to be that that's a fact. If life is about to revise that fact, if it is about to be rewritten, then it can begin to loosen up. But at the time that that is the fact, it is limited, or it's not a fact. That this is either true or not true. That a fact is either what it is or it's not a fact. Because for a fact to be a fact, it has got to be limited to that. You can't say, well, by and large, that is a fact, except for this. It's no longer a fact. So that's the limited part. The other part, the adjectives I was retelling from this great mythical place, is rigid, which is a variation of limited, but the rigidness is as long as the fact is a fact, that it's not open to any other possibility. It has to be rigid in the human intellect. Not just out here. It's not just that you've got the logic police somewhere hiding, the fact police that say, wait a minute, don't you go around, maybe you said something's a fact. You're staying in a bar, you're trying to settle a bet, and you tell somebody, yeah, blah, 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 and that's a fact, buddy. And suddenly the fact police come out and say, that's not a fact. That's your damn opinion. Plus you're drinking. Plus it's a drinking opinion. It has to be rigid, not just out there. There's no institution, that's why I made up the fact police, to actually enforce this. All there is, but you're talking about life. And so in the human intellect itself, it has to be rigid. If it became less than rigid, would be one definition, one operational definition I may suggest, which is of no great importance, but that is part of what would be going on in people who say they are, or other people say they're getting a little flaky. You know, their seams are coming loose, you know, in the tapestry of their mind. Because if things that you thought that you just normally accepted as being facts, you wake up one morning and you look in the mirror and you go, Hubert Gruber, is that you? Assuming the guy's name is Hubert Gruber, and he looks off and he thinks, is that me? That kind of thing. In other words, the facts of life begin to be less than rigid, then people are inclined to either hurt themselves, embarrass other people, be put away, and us faithful taxpayers have to support some more. That kind of thing. Facts must be rigid. Facts also, so it's not literally synonymous with limited and rigid, but it must be repetitious. A fact does not even have a good life. It is not really healthy. That is, life's not really going to be using it much unless it is repetitious. Why is it that, where'd the term truism come from? That the more things seem to be factual, the more people want to repeat them. Well, what's the sense in life? To help your fellow man, or whatever it is. What is God? God is love. Jesus, I've heard that 1,000. God is love, that's it. Of course, then I might refer you back to that which is of least substantial value and talent is that which is talked up the most. It is connected to the fact that knowledge, facts, but knowledge has got to be repetitious. The more, at any particular time, the more from some view that some piece of knowledge, scientific, social, otherwise, the more important role any piece of knowledge seems to be playing at that time, the more it is repeated. Surely nobody is back at old intelligence enough to say, well, that's beyond being self-evident. That's of no importance. Think about it. It has got to be repetitious. The greater the role that whatever the knowledge is playing at any particular time, the more it is repetitious. So ask yourself, if you've got this strange place that you might be able to operate from just for a second, if it's actually knowledge, if what we're talking about is a fact in whatever field, why you got to keep repeating it? Like if you are Hubert Gruber, and there's no doubt you're Hubert, you have to constantly look in the mirror. You have to fill out your billfold and check, or see where your mama sold in Hubert Gruber in your underwear for count. If you know something for a fact, where would be the need for repetition? I'll leave it to you. I'll leave it to you. All right, then what I was going to say, vis-a-vis knowledge, and it being a thing, knowledge being a conclusion, and knowledge being, in and of itself, limited, rigid, and repetitious, then thinking would be a process, and it would be infinite, flexible, and diverse. In fact, everything your mother, the city, warned you about. You just heard it other ways. You heard her say, don't hang around a man at the playground with a 50-gallon bag of M&Ms and a raincoat on. And you thought it had to do something with morality, or it had to do with, don't have anything to do with ideas. That aspect of life that could be, and I say infinite, just in a 3D sense, that is not limited. The ordinary intelligence cannot find, where do I stop thinking? So it is compared to knowledge being limited, rigid, and repetitious, then thinking would be infinite, flexible, and diverse. And those are the things, you just heard it another way, those are the things your mother, everybody's mother, the city, the secondary world, the end of the nervous system that talks, that's the things that warned you about under other names. All kinds of stories, myths, tales. It warned you against that, because that will not lead to a collection of knowledge. It will not. You would never come to an end of a sentence. You would be forever tempted by this guy with the M&Ms and the raincoat that doesn't seem to be all that tightly wrapped. Of course, there are lots of people hanging around, I think about now, schools and campuses are not tightly wrapped, but from an ordinary view, old intelligence, in fact, would very likely say this, if questioned. Is why I would start out saying don't confuse thinking and knowledge. Because operationally, old ordinary intelligence cannot make the separation that I hope some of you will grasp before the next 30 or 40 minutes is over. Ordinary intelligence would say that there is an inseparable connection between thinking and knowledge, quite specifically, in that the whole purpose of thinking is to collect knowledge. Oh, in the city, yeah. But to a revolutionist, the purpose of thinking is thinking. The purpose of thinking is not to collect knowledge. The purpose of thinking itself is an end unto itself. But at the city, no matter how intelligent, no matter who you are, that is not so. Thinking, and I would have no difficulty if somebody of ordinary intelligence heard all of this thus far, I would have no problem with getting ordinary people to say, all right, there's a difference between thinking and knowledge. I hear what you're saying. They could even say, well, I could have figured out that. Thinking is some kind of process. That's like study. It's not that far from studying. But thinking is to come to a place of getting some knowledge. In other words, if you wanted to learn how to plumb, you would study, but by studying, of course, and you might go apprentice yourself somewhere, but you would have to think. You would have to say, all right, now tell me what to do, Master Plumber. You'd take all this and you'd think about it. And you say, well, now, how is that related to? And he'd tell you, and you go, all right, I got that. And so then the day might come that you had enough facts that you were a master plumber, that you had the facts. So the whole idea to old intelligence of thinking, and it could say, yeah, thinking is obviously a verb. Thinking, they could take my terms and say, all right, thinking is a process. But it's a process to take you to a place of knowledge, to gather knowledge, to establish knowledge. And in the city, that's true. But to a revolutionist, if there's any chance of you developing this kind of life at a new neural building spot, the process of thinking is not to reach a conclusion. The purpose of thinking is to think. The purpose of thinking is to think some more. And do I have to say that, well, I already did, that we're inferring a little more from their myth, I think. A little more than just thinking. Because I'm certainly not talking about, or they're not talking about connected thought, routine thought, sequential thought. You could even define from their myth a subversive or a new level of what thinking is. That thinking would be the process of processes. Since this is all very simple tonight, how about I'll throw in a quick one. An oblique aside. I'm going to leave this one with you. Just based upon what we have covered thus far. But if you like to think back, just superfluous knowledge of the growth in this century of quantum physics, that they had no problem accepting the fact, once Einstein and whoever else it was. Anyway, the idea that matter, from the quantum view, actually came in little discrete units, was the basis, supposedly, of the term quantum physics. But then, the difficulty, and I understand in some quarters, a continuing difficulty, of accepting the same to be true with energy. Whereas energy and matter, they thought they'd already established, that they're simply different forms of the same thing, okay. And so anything that applies to one's got to apply to the other in some form, And so we can see, we can empirically, we can laboratorially show that matter comes in discrete quantum measurable, separate units. But when it comes to energy, many people got severe headaches, and as I say, I understand that some of them continue to this day from certain views. What I was going to ask you off on your own, I'm not going into it. At least we all get it. Could you in some way find any subversive parallel in the matter of things versus processes? Or, more up to date now, in the matter regarding knowledge versus thinking? I wasn't going to say more about it. But to me, don't look so blank. All right, I'm going to leave it, but ordinary minds that were interested in such matters seem to, as a complete professional whole, say that yes, I can see, we can accept that matter comes in discrete, measurable, separate units. But energy? Just take that. Do you see in parallel between knowledge and thinking? That knowledge obviously comes in discrete. You get facts, is what I meant. But thinking. Aren't you glad that I didn't go into it any further? All right, now, how about for something a little more practical? Or for those of you who are still, or whose parents perhaps were frightened by William James, for something more pragmatic. According to these myths, all right, I'll drop that. I'm just going to tell you. All right, based on it, but I'm just going to throw in my own 2 cents worth. If somebody were pursuing the way of thinking, not the way of knowledge, which also, if anybody thinks that I am so limited in my metaphysical and other important areas of education, I know that throughout history there have been things called the way of knowledge and ways of power and ways of men wearing dresses and ways of lighting candles and ways of, I know all that. I just am not going to continue, it's no big deal, but to come up with synonyms for every damn thing in the world. Well, for one reason, because here I actually mean the way of knowledge and the way of thinking. There's no better way to put it. But it has no relationship to anything of some shaman or some Indian or some Hindu or some anybody. But the difference between the way of knowledge, which is, forget any kind of cult or any kind of specific reference to a religion or some offshoot of religion, the way of knowledge is the way of the ordinary, orderly growth of the human intellect. So I don't mean anything limited to a mystical quest of some kind or some strange person here and there, although I understand still a few strange people here and there. course, that's why I've personally encouraged you to stay away from here and there. The way of knowledge is simply the way, the orderly expansion of the human intellect. That's the way it grows. That's the way you have grown up to this point. That's the way humanity has grown inside the body of life. Knowledge, because it is not growing to some primarily substantial, influential degree at a level below the intellect. Even though we're living longer, I know I'm putting on a little more weight or taking off weight. Physically, men are not changing right now. That's not the point. In the physically as opposed to this. It's here. And so the way of knowledge is everybody's way. Not just those who say, I'm pursuing the way of knowledge as along the lines of some 1957 San Francisco Zen group. The way of knowledge is the orderly, ordinary expansion of the human intellect. But now consider what we're trying to sketch out, the alternative, the way of thinking. Whereas everyone else, from those who would not express it in any manner, to those who might say, yes, I am on some kind of lifelong quest, I am seeking secret knowledge. Notice nobody ever says, I am seeking secret thinking. They never say it there's, they might say, if somebody said, well, now we are the defenders here in this cave right outside of Helsinki or somewhere even more exotic. Yes, we have the secret knowledge here, but you're going to have to go through some sort of process. You're going to have to prove your worth, plus a few shekels here and there. But what is going to be? The rituals all seem to be involved with some new way of thinking. If you go and convert to a new religion, they give you rituals and etc. What they're doing is giving you something new to think about, apparently, and that seems to be the only way. It's the only thing an ordinary intellect can deal with in the three-dimensional world. The only way to come up with new knowledge is you've got to think in a certain way. Because even if they say, all right, we like you and you got plenty of money, so here's the book, here's the secret knowledge, it's right there on that paper. Even that's not enough, because you, even if it's given to you right there, you got to look at it and go, that is, you got to think about it. And the way I'd argue that, you say, well, yeah, you got to read it and you got to make sure that you understand the words and go, yeah. There is a difference that is outside the scope of any area of ordinary intelligence to see that what we're referring to as the way of thinking, as best I can tell you, even with hand gestures, has nothing really to do with knowledge. Because ordinary thinking, even if it was referred to as being extraordinary thinking, even if it was referred to as being mystical, metaphysical, it still has a purpose. And those in the city who would claim to be the most mystical, and who amongst us is ever going to tell somebody that they're not the most mystical? Somebody says they want to be, they might as well say, I'm the smelliest man in the city. Who's going to say, no, you're not? So even, I didn't mean there was any connection. I also didn't mean there was no connection. But even someone who would say that I am interested in things esoteric, I am interested in things outside the ordinary commercial flow of life, and getting ahead in life and social position. I am interested in important matters. But what are they saying? No matter how they phrase it, they're saying that they want some new knowledge. And if you tried to say, well, wait a minute, let me say you on this. What if you jumped in and said, wait, I know exactly what you're talking about, and you have yet to actually be fulfilled. You haven't found an endeavor that completely satisfies. No, I haven't. All right, let me tell you what. It's not knowledge you're after. It's not a thing. What? No. What you're really after is to know how to operate a process. You can take my word for it. That would be just a tremendous hit. You don't need to call in a PR man or advertising. Just state it, and the world is just going to go bonkers. They're all going to run holler. What I am intending for you to see by calling it the way of thinking, has nothing to do with a conclusion. What ordinary intelligence? Now we don't have to look in the city and laugh about people who wouldn't find this of interest. All you got to do is look here. Look at the difficulties of dealing with this at times. Whether you blame me or yourself, who cares? There's a certain amount of, at times, stickiness, shall we say, diciness, uncertainty, somewhere in that general vicinity. But if you tried to tell somebody that, well, if you would undergo, since you seem to be interested, or you say you are, in things outside the normal run of money and fame and fortune and all that, yes, I am. Well, I know what it is that is driving that, and I can, well, first off, I'll tell you, you're actually trying to find a way of doing something. Not just physically, you're trying to find a way of doing something internally. You're not actually after a something. I'd be lucky to hold their attention as long as I was doing that, playing their part. Because the human intellect is built upon episodic consciousness. It is built upon the electrical flow that is not unlike that which drives AC motors. And to try and tell an ordinary intellect that what you're looking for, the great secret, that which would put the salve on your itch, is not a thing, it's not a conclusion, it's not knowledge, it is a process that everybody else thinks is leading to it. What do you mean process? What kind of weird thing? All right, I'm going to tell you, but you're going to be disappointed. Well, no, tell me. Thinking. And then, of course, ordinary intelligence say, you mean I came over here to a meeting, or listen to you talk for 30 minutes for you to tell me that? Hell, I think so much now I'm almost driving myself nuts. Because what I want is the answer. What I want, because I feel like, at times, I keep thinking, I'm going to quit this. When I was younger, I thought this was some kind of heroic adventure upon which I had trekked. But now sometimes I feel like I am driving myself absolutely insane. So don't tell me that the whole thing is to learn how to, or it's involved with thinking. I've been doing that for 30, 40, 50 years. What I want is to get somewhere. I know. I want to get to some conclusion. I know. Back to William James. And him wondering why his brothers stayed in Europe all those years. Of course, I know why, but I can't go into it. The more practical aspect of thinking, the way of thinking versus the way of knowledge, comes to this. If a person, we'll have to say now, a real revolutionist, whatever we mean, somebody actually involved on the way of thinking, for them, there are critical times, and they arise. They arise when you're trying to walk the path of thinking. They arise when you realize that knowledge is now either interfering with your actions or with further thinking. That is practical indeed, and we got a few minutes, and I'm sure you've got a few brain cells left that might still stir about, because all of you have been confronted with this, and it, as always, absolutely belies all ordinary sanity. In the city, to have knowledge of something, not just plumbing, but all the way from plumbing to where will I go when I die? Or why is life unjust? Why am I not better treated? The answer to all of that is what? Knowledge. I don't mean the specific answer, but whatever it is, the answer to every question is what? Well, an answer, and which is, well, knowledge. Okay. The critical time, if you were involved on the way of thinking, not of knowledge, is at the times you realize that what is now stopping me is the very thing that everyone else thinks is just within reach or would be the solution. Is to realize I cannot think any further. My thinking is being now thwarted, or else I have been rendered almost physically impotent by my knowledge. The very thing that everyone else believes, well, right now I don't know how to act, I don't know what to do next, and what I need is some additional knowledge. And people will go seek advice, they'll look in a book, or they'll go meditate. Ordinary intelligence tells you that if you reach a point that you feel almost immobilized, or that your thinking processes seem to be in a state of confusion, uncertainty, what is lacking? What do you need? More knowledge. Someone attempting to operate on the basis of thinking, not of knowledge, is confronted continually, and you've just never had any occasion whatsoever to see it in this way or to think about it in this way. The critical times continually arise, and the more you pursue this path, the more often they seem to arise. Is to realize, contrary to what ordinary intelligence, that is, the ordinary three-dimensional, stable expansion of life, the way in which everyone else is supposed to be growing. Contrary to that is you realize I can no longer think any further. And in fact, I may be in my activities, my actions, not just thinking of action, but my actions, I seem to have now been rendered sterile, powerless, and the very thing that's doing it is knowledge. I guess that deserves some further comment, but I don't care. All right. Well, how about a mighty damn fine example? Well, in fact, it's not just mighty damn fine, it's the example. I like it when we can hit up on one. This is the example. After this, there's nothing else to be said, really. Doesn't mean we won't say anything else. But, in case this seems like still part of an oblique aside, which is not. Someone attempting to pursue a revolutionist way, a way of thinking, not a way of knowledge, a way of thinking, suddenly realizes, intellectually sees, that his knowledge in and of all sorts of things, psychology, his knowledge of psychology, his knowledge of religion, and I'm using knowledge in the widest possible sense, his knowledge, his conventional knowledge of how life is, his everyday common wisdom. This is all his knowledge. But a revolutionist, let's say, reaches the point, he suddenly intellectually sees that whatever the conditions are that we're describing, this sudden arbitrary place in his life in which we are injecting ourselves, he suddenly sees that his knowledge of all sorts of things, of psychology, of conventional thinking, wisdom, of religion, that his knowledge right now is telling him, this is the example, that his knowledge is telling him, you've gone as far as you can go. His knowledge is telling him, yes, at least right here, you are a helpless pawn of fate. There is nothing else you can do. Or, on a more religious side, there's nothing else you should do. But it's really, there's nothing else you can do. You have reached that brick wall with whatever the relation is. It's always something to do with the city. It's not primary affairs, because there is no question of primary affairs. You're hungry, you might starve to death, but at least you know what to do. And you're about to horny to death, you know what to do. Maybe you can't find anybody to take you up on it, but at least you know what to do. But we're still talking about the secondary world that I can't seem to move. I can't seem to go any further with my profession, with this relationship, not just sexually, but here it is, this relationship is romantic. It's all secondary we're talking about. And everybody, they don't have to ever use the word fatalistic. They don't have to be some very primitive Southern Baptist or whoever still believes in predestination, because that's what it amounts to, all these ideas of fatalism and religious predestination, and the God's already deciding beforehand who's going to live and who's going to die and who's going to succeed. All of that are just very crude city reflections like hand shadows. But the reality, you're just seeing the shadows, the reality is that knowledge, finally, which seems to be a conclusion in people's thinking, is constantly people come up to the point, whether they say it or not, that their knowledge, they might say it was their experience, their knowledge says there's nothing else you can do. Their knowledge is actually speaking about a kind of genetic fatalism. Their knowledge is saying, whether it be religious, and it may come out, if you ask them, well, why did you quit struggling against this problem? Or how did you overcome this problem that you were worried about 2 weeks ago when I saw you? I don't know. I just realized I'd done all a human can do, and I just turned it over to the gods. I talked to a priest, I talked to a rabbi, and they said, well, hell, I don't know either. That's the way life is, and all we can do is trust it to the gods. It could be that, or somebody, you could say, well, how did you get over this problem that you were just sweating bullets about 2 weeks ago? And let's say it's somebody who is not religious, and this person could say, well, I thought. I got a friend's a psychiatrist. I'm no longer in analysis, but I called him. We had a few drinks. I talked about it, and I don't know whether you know it, but I actually did some undergraduate work in psychology and then when I got to thinking, it was to the point that there's something in my past. Now I know part of it's got to be having to do with my father and his drinking and all that. But anyway, it's to the point that I have been through this kind of thing before, and this problem, the way it's presented itself, I have done. Now, I'm not making excuses, but I have done all that I consciously know how to do. Now, I can get my wife to agree. I can bring out witnesses. You can say, well, I'm your friend. I believe you. I have done all I can consciously do, so whatever is now standing in my way, it's beyond the level of which I can deal with it. That is, it's unconscious, subconscious. I don't know what to do. All of that's the same thing. All of that is knowledge telling the person, hey, that's it. That is the critical times for somebody attempting to pursue a revolutionist kind of path of thinking, not knowledge. Because that is the critical time to act as soon as you realize my knowledge is stopping me from acting. But the knowledge is not wrong. In the city, the knowledge is correct. I assume you didn't get choked on me using examples all the way from psychology to religion. It's just in the city. You wouldn't have to use either term. In ordinary life, people are continually confronted with somebody, I seem to have a problem. And then you look at it, and maybe you try several things, maybe even just think about them. But as far as you're concerned, your knowledge is, hey, there's nothing I can do about it. Could be. We're not questioning that. But if you're attempting to pursue a different way, which would be thinking, a non-conclusive process, as opposed to an ordinary way of knowledge, that is the critical time. That your knowledge tells you, hey, there's nothing else you can do. But one more time I'll point out, at that level, I'm not saying that's incorrect. The Pope, the head rabbis, the president, your mama, your father, everybody, constantly has to go, I can't do anything else. That's true enough at that level. That is the critical time, though, if you're going to pursue and try and use the idea of a way of thinking as opposed to a way of knowledge. It is then that you have got to act. And by act, it does not have to be a material, that is a three-dimensional spatial act that you do, but what you've got to do is skip. You've got to step aside from that path of knowledge because it is stopping you from any additional thinking. But the knowledge at that level could be correct. The knowledge could say, hey, there's nothing you can do about this. And the way of thinking doesn't say that that's wrong. It's why I'm trying to play both parts. The way of thinking just whistles and walks on by, if you want it that way. If you consider it's two kind of paths that are running somewhere close to each other, which of course they're real close, but in the way of knowledge, your knowledge, inside of you, your knowledge, and let's assume that you're just as sane, sophisticated, as full of facts, as anybody else. See, I didn't say full of shrimp. That the way of knowledge says, there's nothing you can do about this. Or there's nothing you should do about this. This is you. Or this is life. On that path, we're not saying that's incorrect. And if that was the path over here of knowledge, and there's another path going here of thinking, a process, not a thing, an ongoing process, not an end, not a means to an end, it is the end. The process exists, that is thinking, in and for itself, not to get to a place of knowledge. So on that path, if you could go over to thinking instead of seeking a solution, a fact, an answer. It's not that if you're over here at a new building site and you looked over where your old site is, old intelligence going, hey, there's nothing else we can do. I mean, that's the way I am. I may not be perfect. I may have a few warts. I'm too fat. I'm too skinny. Whatever it's whining about, it's telling what kind of guy it is. It's making all the self-reference of, look, I have tried everything. I've hurt my back trying to do this. Maybe. And it's not that a way of thinking would go, you're nuts, or that that's wrong. It's two different things. And the critical point is, when you get to where you can continually recognize that as far as my knowledge is concerned, and you don't question the knowledge, unless you're just absolutely determined to waste the rest of your life. Because your knowledge, you got the same way that you got your hair color. So your knowledge is not questioning, wait a minute, if I just rearrange my knowledge a little bit, if you're going to do that, tell me that you can stick your hand down inside your spine and everywhere else, and you're going to just put a slight little spin, you're going to fine-tune your DNA. It's not that the knowledge is wrong, but thinking is something else. Thinking is a process. And the critical time is to see, well, my knowledge is stopping me from additional thinking. That is when it's critical. And notice I'm not saying, one more time, that knowledge in some way, anybody's knowledge, is in some way intrinsically flawed. That's not it. Knowledge is what it is. Knowledge is a continual expansion, is a continual quantum movement of the human intelligence, of a part of life's own body inside of man's nervous system. And it goes as it should. But it is not a process. There is no way to fine-tune, there is no way to rewrite it, there's no way to revise it from a revolutionist view. That is, from a view of making it work and being able to change it in your lifetime. There's nothing to do with knowledge. It's not right or wrong. It's just one thing, and thinking is something else. But when you realize my knowledge is stopping me from additional thinking, and it's no discussion, because if you then were able to do this and jump over to your knowledge and say, wait a minute, what kind of dumb knowledge are you giving me? It's not giving you dumb knowledge. Knowledge is knowledge, and at that level, it's correct. To say, wait a minute, you're giving me wrong knowledge. It's beside the point. Doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong. If it's stopping you from a revolutionist view, it's to be avoided, but you can't say it's wrong. It's all right over here if we're talking about the laws that govern the life of turtles. All right. If you're over here trying to play sparrow, you can't say, well, the laws of turtles are incorrect. The laws of turtles are just right for turtles. What kind of bird would be trying to fly and stay in some kind of running argument, looking over there at the world of turtles and hollering, boy, you guys dumb. You'll never fly like that. Hell, they're not trying to fly. Old intelligence is not trying to think. Old intelligence is trying to collect new quantums of facts. It's trying to collect new knowledge. It's trying to come to conclusions. When they come to a conclusion that seems astounding, the Nobel Committee gets together and they give the guy a prize. Thinking is something else. And you might note, thinking, once you see how, well, all of you got some taste of it, thinking, this kind of thinking, begets thinking. And the critical times is when you notice that that process has stopped. I've been thinking along certain lines, and I'm beginning to know what thinking is. And then suddenly you realize that you've stopped, and you're chewing on some knowledge somewhere. Especially when something happens in life, like somebody steps on your private parts or backs into your car, and you go, well, wait a minute. And you're having to start dealing with knowledge. Knowledge does not beget thinking. Knowledge stops thinking. Why would you continue to think about something once you've got the facts? Nobody would. The only thing is, somebody thinking never has the facts. They're beyond that. No, facts are for children. Unless, of course, you live in a child's world, and then you can ignore all this because it's simply, it's not harmful, but it's just a waste of time. But now I think about what else have children got to do? All right, conclusion time. I'm at the end of the tape. Compared to knowledge, I was going to just wrap up a few little things right quick verbally. Well, thinking, the way of thinking, would have these kind of aspects. Of course, somebody dealing with knowledge couldn't see them, but I'll go ahead and give them to you. You can say that the way of thinking would be free of all dogma, all restrictions, all reason, all sequence. It would be absolutely unconnected to any form of self-reference. That's not thinking. Because once it is self-referring, it's knowledge. Because in it's, well, I think so-and-so. You may say, I think so-and-so. What you're saying is, I know so-and-so. And of course, the revolutionist knows anybody that says, I know so-and-so, don't know so-and-so. And they don't have to look anywhere. You got you. You've had you all these years. Every time you say, well, I'll tell you this. I may not know a lot, but I know this. But now you know, hell, he didn't know that. Well, he knew it, but it didn't do him any good. So it is unconnected to any self-reference. It is not a friend. It is not a foe to anybody, to anything. It is not a slave. It is not a master to any known dance routine. That is, it's not, will not fit into the ordinary shoes of submissive or dominant. And, all right, the finale of finales. You could also define, take this, that knowledge equals seriousness. And everybody knows seriousness also equals death. But knowledge equals seriousness. Knowledge is always serious. Nobody laughs around about knowledge. You should know that. Knowledge is equals seriousness. Whereas thinking, to compare the two, would be equaling festivity, merriment, a higher order enthusiasm. How about that? How about that?